So we've established so far that there are just two routes for all world religions and belief systems. The first route comes from Nimrod, Babylon, and behind it is Satan. The second route comes from Israel, the worship of the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. These are the two competing kingdoms in this world, the kingdom of darkness and the kingdom of light. Now some people, particularly Muslims themselves, would have you believe that Islam belongs to the second route, that it shares its origins with Judeo-Christianity and is something of a continuation of those faiths, that Islam is the last and true revelation of the Judeo-Christian God to his people. Even some Christians have been deceived into thinking that the word Allah is just an Arabic word for the Christian God, Yahweh, and that we are connected somehow. While we can't go through every religion one by one to show the links to Babylon, it's worth taking a little time to study Islam because of its prevalence on the world stage right now. So what I intend to do in this part is briefly show that Islam finds its roots in Babylon. The beginnings of Islam go back to Muhammad, who was born in 570 AD in Mecca, and who is revered in Islam as the last great prophet of God, usurping the authority and preeminence of Moses, Elijah, and even Jesus himself. Because religions tend to assume the character of their founding figure, this is the best place to start in understanding Islam. The Muslims have one holy book called the Quran, and several other volumes called Hadith, which are oral traditions relating to the words and deeds of Muhammad. Hadiths are considered important tools for determining the Muslim way of life. Sahih al-Bukhari and Sahih Muslim are thought to be particularly authoritative. According to the Hadith of Bukhari, Muhammad used to retire to a cave alone, where he would spend long periods of time, several days, praying to Allah. It was in the cave that he experienced an encounter with an angel who apparently gave him a revelation from God. The angel asked him to read some writing, whereupon he replied that he couldn't read. Muhammad was illiterate. The angel then pressed upon him with such force and in such a way that he felt like he was going to die. Clearly it was a distressing experience. Upon returning to his wife Khadija, he is reported to have been terrified, indeed his neck muscles twitching with terror, and convinced that he had encountered something satanic. Now his wife Khadija had a Roman Catholic cousin called Waraka. Khadija ran to Waraka to report this experience to him to see if he had any insight from his Catholic religion. In response, Waraka wrongly referenced Moses as receiving revelations from the angel Gabriel in this manner, and suggested this could have been what had happened to Muhammad. The angel Gabriel is in fact only mentioned in the Bible 4 times, twice in Daniel and twice in Luke, and never in relation to Moses. After hearing about this, however, Muhammad's mind was changed about who he had just had an encounter with. He began to think of himself as a prophet who had been visited by an angel of God. As a result of this experience, however, Muhammad became suicidal and attempted to kill himself on multiple occasions. He had 2 main periods of suicidal thinking, where he began attempting to throw himself from mountains in a bid to find relief from mental torture. I said to myself, your humble servant is either a poet or a madman, but Quraysh shall never say this of me. I shall take myself to a mountain crag, hurl myself down from it, kill myself, and find relief in that way. The second period of suicidal thoughts came when these visitations ceased. The inspiration ceased to come to the messenger of God for a while, and he was deeply grieved. He began to go to the tops of mountain crags in order to fling himself from them. From these passages that show Muhammad's suicidal mental state, it seems clear he was visited not by an angel but by a demon, or possibly Satan himself, as Muhammad himself had first suspected. Now visitations from angels who give people a different message were foreseen by the Apostle Paul in his letter to the Galatians. There we read, "But even if we or an angel from heaven should preach a gospel other than the one we preach to you, let them be under God's curse. As we have already said, so now I say again, if anybody is preaching to you a gospel other than what you accepted, let them be under God's curse." The cave experience was not the first time Muhammad had been in contact with something demonic. He apparently had a strange but undefined experience as a child, after which his carer became convinced he had been possessed by a demon. Further evidence for potential demonic possession comes even within the Quran. In Surah 81:22-25 and Surah 69:41-42, people claim that Muhammad was inspired by the devil and something of a madman. Further evidence of Muhammad's mental disturbance is to be found in the Hadith of Bukhari, volume 7 and number 660. For a whole year, he was so bewitched and befuddled that he thought he was having sexual relations with his wives when he wasn't. This is a strange scenario which can realistically only have two explanations. Either mental illness caused him to hallucinate, or he had some kind of sexual encounters with demonic entities. Either way, Muhammad was clearly disturbed. At one point in time, Muhammad admitted that Satan had put words in his mouth to compromise with pagan idol worship. These words have become known as the Satanic Verses. He later changed his mind on the issue, but it shows that he was unable to distinguish the source of his revelation. Another politically incorrect but equally true assertion is that he was a paedophile, marrying his wife Aisha when she was 6 years old and consummating the relationship when she was only 9. Muhammad was over 50 years old at the time. All kinds of arguments have been put forward in an attempt to excuse this behaviour. Muhammad in fact had over 20 wives in his lifetime, while hypocritically restricting his own followers to just 4. One of his followers says, "I embraced Islam while I had 8 wives, so I mentioned it to the Prophet. The Prophet said, 'Select 4 of them.'" Muhammad himself was so filled with insatiable lusts and sexual desire that he would have relations with all of his wives in one night. Anas bin Malik said, "The Prophet used to visit all his wives in a round during the day and night, and there were 11 in number. I asked Anas, had the Prophet the strength for it? Anas replied, we used to say that the Prophet was given the strength of 30 men. And now we can understand a little why Muslims are promised constant fornication with virgins in their paradise. It reflects the character of their Prophet. In this we also see similarities with the prominence of sexuality in occultism. Finally, as we look for links to Babylon, it should also be noted that Muhammad's visitations came in caves. As we noted way back at the start of the study, Babylonian worship, particularly relating to Nebo, happened in caves and was common practice in the mysteries. Muhammad was born into a culture where moon god worship was dominant. Furthermore, he was born into the Quraysh tribe, who were particularly devoted to the moon god. According to numerous inscriptions, the title of this moon god was Al-Ilah, which means the deity or the god, meaning that he was the chief or high god amongst many gods. Al-Ilah, the god, was shortened to Allah in pre-Islamic times. Now this part may be slightly confusing. Until now we have seen that in the Babylonian system the sun is always presented as a male god and the moon presented as a female goddess, and yet here we find talk of a male moon god, not a moon goddess. This is because there were certain branches where the roles were reversed. The male divinity became the moon and the female divinity became the sun. This form of the mysteries was particularly prevalent in Arabia and amongst the Saxons and Norsemen of Europe. This role reversal remained widespread around Arabia in particular, long after its popularity had waned elsewhere. Echoes of this lesser-known form still exist today. For example, Cush, Nimrod's father, was worshipped as a god under the title Meni or Manai, which means the numberer. He is accredited under the Babylonian system with inventing arithmetic. Now such has been the influence of the Saxons and Norsemen in particular on Scotland, that we have a New Year festival that still exists today called Hogmanay, and this comes from Hogmanay, which means the feast of the numberer, who numbers the years. Another small example of how Babylon permeates our culture. Muhammad's father and uncle both had the name Allah incorporated into their own names. His father was called Abdallah, and his uncle was called Obidallah. This echoes the Babylonian practice of incorporating your god into your own name, and illustrates the preeminence of the moon god cult in his time. This fact answers the questions, why is Allah never defined in the Quran? Why did Muhammad assume that the pagan Arabs already knew who Allah was? The answer is because they already did know who Allah was. He was their moon god. Muhammad wasn't attempting to introduce the concept of a new god in the Quran. He was merely building on the one that already existed in the area. All Muhammad did was go one step further than his fellow pagan Arabs. While they believed that Allah, the moon god, was the greatest of all gods in a whole pantheon of gods, Muhammad said that Allah was not just the greatest god amongst many, but that he was in fact the only god. In effect, he said, "Look, you already believe that the moon god Allah is the greatest of all gods. All I want you to do is accept the idea that he is the only god. I'm not taking away the Allah you already worship. I'm only taking away his wife and his daughters and all the other gods." Here is a picture of an Allah idol recovered in Arabia. Note the crescent moon on his chest. The pagan Arabs never accused Muhammad of preaching a different Allah to the one they already worshipped, and archaeological evidence proves that he was one and the same. The Encyclopedia of Religion says, Allah is a pre-Islamic name corresponding to the Babylonian Bel. Allah is nothing more than Baal again with a new name. Muhammad attempted to have it both ways though. To pagans he said that he still believed in the moon god Allah, but to the Jews and the Christians he said that Allah was their god too. In effect, it was the same technique that Catholic bishops had used to merge Christianity with paganism. Many Christians today have swallowed the lie that Allah is the same as the Christian God, when he is in fact Baal. Fortunately, Jews and Christians of that time recognized Muhammad's deceptive ideas and rejected Allah as a false god. Of course, this angered Satan no end, and by consequence it angered his puppet Muhammad no end. And we know that when plan A, manipulation and flattery, fails with Satan, he quickly resorts to plan B, intimidation and persecution. We perhaps never see this more clearly than in the relationship Muhammad had with the Jews. The Quran has a distinct split personality that correlate to two periods in Muhammad's life. At the start of his life in Mecca, he was relatively obscure and had no particular type of influence. He was in a position of weakness. In the second part of his life, he moved to Medina as a wealthy and powerful warlord. There, he was in a position of power. So all the earlier writings from his time in Mecca are generally peaceful. This was the period when Muhammad was in a position of weakness and trying to convince the local Jews that he was a prophet of their God, the Plan A years. All the later writings from his time in Medina, after he had risen to a position of wealth and power, are full of hate and anger towards the Jews who had rejected him. These are the Plan B years. He started calling for their slaughter and waged war against them, along with anyone else who rejected him or his message. Now it's important to understand that in Islam there is a principle of abrogation. This simply means that wherever there is a contradiction between verses and the Quran contradicts itself a fair amount, the later one cancels out the earlier one. So since the violent, warring verses are the later ones from his time in Medina, they cancel out the earlier, peaceful ones from his time in Mecca. This has been a great tool of deception for Muslims, as whenever they are challenged about the violent fruits of their religion, they point to the peaceful Mecca verses. In ignorance, the average person takes them at their word, completely unaware that those verses are effectively null and void under the principle of abrogation. They have been replaced by later commands to slaughter all non-believers and conquer the world. It is Muhammad's words and actions from the Medina years that fuel Islam's never-ending hatred towards the Jews and the problems in the Middle East. It is the words and actions of Muhammad in the Medina years that encourages and condones all forms of terrorism, lying, deceit, violence, murder of non-believers, oppression and domination as a service to Allah. Islamic terrorists are not acting contrary to the example of Muhammad their prophet. They are acting in perfect harmony with his own actions 1400 years ago. The Bible says that, "You shall know a tree by the fruit it bears." The entire history of Islam has been littered with this type of violence, and when we look at the life of Muhammad in any detail, we will discover why. It produces bad fruit because it was a bad tree with its roots in the kingdom of darkness. The following are the recorded words and deeds of Muhammad. In the following example, we see Muhammad suddenly and conveniently receive a message from Allah to rape captured women. This event shows a particular audacity, permitting rape at the drop of a hat simply by conjuring a verse from Allah to support it out of thin air. Any whim or fancy that took him could be acted upon if he claimed he was doing it under divine authority or instruction. Muhammad understood what Nimrod and Semiramis understood, that spiritual authority gives temporal authority. Wherever Satan is involved, there is often a telltale hatred for the Jews, and this comes through loud and clear in Islam. Here, the unbelieving brother was seemingly impressed with Islam's ability to influence people to kill Jews and family members. This practice continues to this day in the Muslim community. Parents will kill children and brothers will kill siblings who leave Islam and call it a mercy killing. The brother in this instant converted on the spot, although we can't be sure he didn't do it out of self-preservation. Islam has a long history of forced conversions where the alternative is death. Muslims have been taught that their redemption will not come until all Jews have been destroyed, and therefore they will not stop fighting against them until they have reached this end. The Prophet Ezekiel reports a time when Arab nations will team up with Russia to attempt to wipe out Israel. They will be driven to do this partly because of this prophecy. If the Jews are not wiped out, according to Islam, their false Messiah can't come. Do not be misled by claims of Muslims that their gripe with Israel is about land. Satan wants the Jews destroyed, as he has done from the beginning of time. He has hardwired this desire into the core of Islam through Muhammad, and they will work towards that end, no matter how much land Israel gives them. Muslims believe that they must kill all Jews, or their religion has been proved to be false. It's that simple. The United Nations are attempting to create a two-state solution where Jews and Palestinians share the land, but we know from our studies of the character of the satanic Jezebel spirit that it will not be content to share control of anything. It will have no equals. The goal of Islam is to extend its influence until it rules the entire world. In Islam, the world is currently divided into two, the House of Islam and the House of the Unbeliever or Infidel. They foresee a day when the whole earth will become Islamic and work continuously towards this end. The name Islam actually means submission, and this refers to the whole world submitting to the rule of the pagan moon god Allah, Allah being another name for Baal, and Baal being Satan. They believe that world peace will only come when they have triumphed over all the so-called infidel. The fact that Allah is the moon god explains why the primary symbol of Islam is the crescent moon. It is also why Muslims fast during the month which begins and ends with the appearance of the crescent moon in the sky. What about the star that so often accompanies it? This is an adaptation of the old symbol for the sexual joining of the male and female deity. These are Egyptian and Babylonian examples. Islam has adopted other important features and rites that betray its pagan roots. Mecca, the holy city of Islam, was also the center for pagan religions of pre-Islamic Arabia, for example. At the center of the pagan worship in Mecca was the square stone temple called the Kaaba. Following the widespread belief in the powers of magic stones, the famous black stone was embedded in the wall of the Kaaba. Such black stones were found in other places in the pagan Middle East and were representative of Saturn. The pagans of pre-Islamic Arabia believed that they needed to bow and pray towards Mecca at set times in the day. Furthermore, they believed that one should make a pilgrimage to worship at the Kaaba at least once in one's lifetime, to process round the Kaaba 7 times and to kiss the black stone. All these rites were continued in Islam. The Quraysh tribe saw to it that all manner of different religions were allowed in the Kaaba, so as to extend the influence of Mecca as a centre for many religions. There were about 360 different idols in the Kaaba in addition to an idol of Allah. Today we find the black cube, which originally represented Saturn, all over the world. Fans of the Transformers movies will know that it portrays the cube as the source of all life. In that movie, both Decepticon and Autobot, good and evil, comes from this one force. The same philosophical idea is found in many other movies like Star Wars, Harry Potter and Wizard of Oz. A key trait of occultism is the idea that behind both the sun and moon, light male and dark female is one source. The force itself is neutral, but can be used for good or evil. Incidentally, you'll also notice a lot of pyramids and sun symbols in the second movie in particular. The third installment, which is called The Dark of the Moon, is out in the summer of 2011, so keep an eye out for symbolism and hidden messages if you watch it. Muhammad removed the idols from the Kaaba, but nobody knows, however, what's left inside. No one really knows what they're worshipping towards when they face it. Questions about this would be sacrilege for a Muslim to ask, since Islam, like Catholicism, does not encourage freedom of inquiry or conscience. Just before we move on from this short exploration of Islam, I want to make it clear that when this series is titled Know Your Enemy, it does not refer to any human being or group of human beings. Christians are to have no human enemies and are commanded by Jesus to love even those who hate us. The enemy referred to in the title is a spiritual one. As Ephesians 6:12 says, "For we are not fighting against flesh and blood enemies, but against evil rulers and authorities of the unseen world, against mighty powers in this dark world, and against evil spirits in the heavenly places." Referring back to part 2 of this study, our fight is against the king of Tyre, not the princes of Tyre. We are to love Muslims and Catholics and anyone else for that matter, but wage spiritual war against Satan and his hordes who would seek to enslave and destroy humanity. Although Catholicism is a sun god representation of the mysteries, and Islam is a moon god representation, it's interesting to cross-reference them to point out some commonalities that betray a shared origin. Since the end goal of Satan is to undo the scattering of Babylon and return the world to a single one-world religion, it is these kinds of commonalities that he will play upon to bring that unity at the end of time. Not just with Catholicism and Islam, but with all religion that stems from Babylon. For example, let's compare the habit that Catholic nuns wear with the hijab that Islamic women are expected to wear. They're almost identical. Also, in both religions, people are taught to pray with beads. Just as Muhammad is said to have received his revelation in a cave, Mary is also depicted as living in caves or grottos in Catholicism. As I've already pointed out, this practice links them to the underground Babylonian worship of Nebo, who is said to have come out of the hole in the ground, and puts us in mind of Revelation 13:11 that talks about a beast coming out from the earth. The mysteries were often celebrated in caves or grottos, and this explains the origin of this practice today and why revelations from Satan are so often given in the darkness. In Fatima, Mary is in a cave. In Lourdes, Mary is in a cave. The Pope and Catholic followers enter into these caves to venerate her and thus perpetuate the Babylonian system. Today we may also associate grottos with the secular Christmas character, Santa Claus. Department stores around the world create Santa's grottos around Christmas time and invite kids to enter into it to receive a gift. Again, this mimics a practice that has gone on for millennia. Although we've briefly looked at holidays already, we may revisit them in depth at the end of the study. Catholicism and Islam stand side by side around the world, often in places that were originally pagan in nature. Cathedrals and mosques are frequently built either next to each other, or the two buildings are incorporated into one. Cordoba in Spain is perhaps the most famous example of a cathedral mosque that was originally one and is now the other. It doesn't matter that the building was once consecrated to Catholicism but is now consecrated to Islam, because both serve the same system. We have noted the sun symbolism in Catholicism. Even though Islam is the moon god version, they still have some sun imagery, like on the ceiling of the King Abdullah Mosque in Jordan. Not entirely different to the concept behind St. Peter's Dome in the Basilica. The sounds of the religions are also similarly solemn. This is the sound of an Islamic call to prayer.
أشهد أن لا إله إلا الله.
Now compare it with the sound of a Gregorian chant. They are both similarly haunting, mournful, and melancholic. Both religions also make use of the telltale satanic all-seeing eye. This is a typical example from an Islamic taxicab, where they are used as a charm to ward off evil and for protection. You will also unsurprisingly find this symbol in Catholicism. This is one example found in the confessional at the Cathedral Milano in Italy. To the ancient Egyptians, the right eye represented the sun and the left eye represented the moon. That is why in Egyptian forms of the eye it is surrounded by makeup that normally identifies it as the right eye, the eye of the sun god, Osiris or Horus to them. In this example, note the sun rays representing the supposed illumination that comes from the eye. One of the great ancient Egyptian temples was the Luxor temple. Helena Blavatsky, an important occult figure that we'll look at later, said that within such temples, obscene acts of homosexuality were conducted as a form of worship to Set. Now the remains of the Luxor temple still stand to this day, and within it you will find a multitude of phallic symbols that echo its original purpose. At the entrance, you will of course find the Asherah pole or obelisk. What is perhaps a little more surprising is that built into the Luxor temple is a mosque. Some Catholics plainly see the similarities with Islam and are looking for a shared future based on the truth that they have the same origin. Vatican insider Dr. David Malachi Martin said that on the basis of a personal message from Mary to Pope John Paul II, he believed that there will come a day when the heart of Islam, already attuned to the figures of Christ and Christ's mother Mary, will receive the illumination it needs, a second Fatima, in which they will recognize him as God's true vicar on earth. Then with fellow travellers like the Church of England, the Episcopal Church and others of like mind, the Pope could be worshipped as the infallible Holy Father by over 1/2 of the world's population. This idea of ecumenism or unity between religions is gaining a lot of momentum in the world today, and behind it is the fact that Satan wants to reverse the scattering of Babylon and bring the whole world together again under his mystery religion. Given that the false religions of the world share the same root, they all have commonalities which are to be highlighted to achieve this end. The idea is to bring the world under the headship of the Pope, because he is the earthly head of the mysteries. Because of Muhammad's Catholic influence, Muslims already believe in Mary's Immaculate Conception and virgin birth. So high is their view of Mary that the Quran concludes she must be a goddess in Christianity. It therefore teaches that Christians believe in the Father, the Mother and the Son. This is an error that comes by observing Catholicism's overemphasis on Mary as a deity. In fact, Father, Mother and Son is the Babylonian Trinity. The Christian Trinity is Father, Son and Spirit. The Islamic system of salvation is one of justification by works, which is the same as Catholicism and all false religion in fact. The Quran teaches that on the Day of Judgment, good and bad works will be weighed up in a balance to decide whether or not someone goes to heaven or hell. This is just like the scales of Anubis or St. Michael in Rome. In Islamic states, there is no division between religion and politics. This merger of secular and sacred is similar to the Church of Rome, where the sovereign pontiff is both head of the religion and a reigning monarch. A final similarity with the Church of Rome is persecution, firstly of Jews and secondly of Christians. This is an indicator of Satan's presence. The Jews were granted full citizenship of Rome in 212 AD. However, when the empire became Catholicized under Constantine 100 years later, this toleration of Jews declined and persecution began. This was the start of a long history of terrible persecution of Jews by the Church of Rome. Likewise, we have already seen how Muhammad developed a hatred of the Jews and took to attacking and massacring them. In conclusion, we should be careful not to bow to the pressure of the politically correct lobby and blaspheme the name of God by placing him on a level with Allah, or to even suggest that they are one and the same under different names. Allah is Baal. We should also be clear in refusing to compromise with Catholicism and its Babylonian ways.